Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter.
We'd like to say that, in our opinion, it is not suitable for children or for those of you who may have a nervous disposition.
One of the most recognisable facets of television is, of course, the branding. Ever since the early days, audiences have associated both the positive and negative aspects of TV largely with the broadcasters that put out the programmes. Here in the UK, arguably the most recognisable brand amongst the broadcasters is the BBC. From the 1950s through to the new millennium, millions can look back fondly over the changing face of the Beeb, how its brand morphed and shifted through various innovations, like colour TV, computer-generated graphics, and the implementation of widescreen. But perhaps the biggest new part of the journey that the BBC, and telly as a whole, would have to undergo would be the onset of digital television.
See that? What? That is the future.
What? A load of noughts and ones?
Exactly. That's digital. The future of broadcasting.
So how do we become digital then?
Well, soon anyone can become digital if they want to, even you.
Ah, now there's a perfect image.
In anticipation of this new way of broadcasting, many companies and corporations would rebrand their image and portfolio to usher in this new era. For the BBC, this would be no exception, and it seemed like there was one man, together with his design team, who were up to the job. Enter Martyn LAMBIE-NAIRN. Martyn and his team were firmly established designers by the 1990s. They'd been responsible for several iconic and memorable idents and logos for broadcasters the world over. Did you know they made this little piece of history? And even though new ident templates have come and gone, that central design of the 4 numeral, that's remained as the one designed by LAMBIE-NAIRN over 40 years ago. And what about these bad boys? The 90s idents for BBC Two, perhaps one of the most recognisable sets of British idents ever created, were the brainchildren of LAMBIE-NAIRN and his team, completely reinventing the personality and perception of BBC Two for a whole new generation. But this wasn't any ordinary commission. Martyn and his team wouldn't just be reinventing 1 or 2 channels, they were tasked with rebranding the BBC's identity from top to bottom. They had to come up with an idea that would encompass and represent the corporation as a whole. This would include all of its television channels, radio channels, other various brands. It was a lot back in the 90s. In 1996, a year before the change was to come into effect, a progress report of sorts was created and hosted by Martyn, entitled Preparing for the Digital Age, the BBC's New Identity. Even at just under 10 minutes, this video is a fascinating insight into Martyn and his team's design processes, the way they craft a new brand identity, and just where the BBC was at in terms of logos and how it needed to change. So let's go through this progress report, and I'll leave you with the master himself, Martyn LAMBIE-NAIRN.
This all started for us as a television project. The BBC was about to create a whole series of new television channels. How they were going to be branded was going to be a very important issue.
At exactly the same time, Corporate Affairs was looking at the whole visual image of the corporation to see if it was capable of serving all the corporation's needs into the 21st century. Clearly, it made sense for the 2 projects to become one. This film is a summary of progress to date. Not the full story, but a broad explanation of the vision and the way forward.
In that little prologue, you can tell that Martyn's team, alongside the BBC, were sharing mutual interests and concerns regarding the corporation's new look and image for not just the new millennium, but the approaching digital age as a whole. Let's see how Martyn breaks down where the BBC was at, in terms of its branding and presentation in the mid-90s.
The way the BBC designs its logos for television brands at the moment revolves around 3 elements: corporate logo, brand name or numeral, and personality of the brand. So the reason BBC World uses this typeface is because it reflects the channel's output, news and information. This approach is also used for the radio networks, BBC Radio, a numeral with personality, and finally, frequency.
It's funny, isn't it, that when broken down into the bare basics terms as Martyn does here, structuring a TV logo makes a lot of sense. Despite the fact you're showing a couple of text bars alongside a name or numeral, the way in which it's presented makes a whole lot of difference to the channel's personality, and in turn, how it's going to be perceived by an eager listener or viewer.
But these aren't the only logos the BBC owns. I know. In fact, under the prevailing branding system, if it's got a name, it's got a logo. There's a logo for locations, the shop has a logo, even the club has a logo. This results in the BBC being the proud owner of zillions of logos.
That was just a smattering. I'm sure there were many, many more logos that he could have shown off there. Also, can we just acknowledge that Martyn is a great host for this sort of video? Not only does he communicate the core aspects of design for television, but he's also pretty funny.
With the BBC about to play a leading role in the digital revolution, the team realised that following the existing branding system for all the new BBC channels and services would mean simply adding more and more logos.
The problem with zillions of logos for any corporation is that they weaken the core brand. Not only that, but they cost a lot of money, between $2,500 and $6,000 each. At the time we got involved in this project, the BBC was generating about 2 logos a week.
Obviously, it was time to call a halt and review the whole process.
Goodness me, logos are expensive. Keep in mind, that figure of between £2,500 and £6,000 is in 1996 money. When adjusted for modern day inflation, creating a new logo would cost the BBC today between £4,877 to £11,705. And considering back in the 90s that 2 logos a week were being made and churned out, that's a very expensive enterprise, both back then and today.
The first thing we needed to do was to ask the question, what's the most important part of the identity? And obviously, it's these 3 letters. More than anything else, they represent a famous brand. They're associated with quality, integrity, and all the positive values of the organisation.
He is absolutely right in what he says about the BBC name. Although some newer generations are starting to use these 3 letters for a completely different term, I can't really say it here, and if you want to find out, I'd browse with extreme caution. I think most of you know what I'm talking about anyway. At least I hope so.
The next stage was to consider the existing brand logo. After all, it focuses on the BBC initials. So what's the problem?
Well, actually, there are 4 sets of problems. Firstly, there are the technical problems. It doesn't work on screen, because when reduced, the little lines disappear, and so do the counters. That's the little bits in the centre of the letters. And off-screen, when it's a colour logo on a colour photograph, it's again possible to disappear. There are other technical problems, but these are problems enough.
The team also identified strategic design problems.
Now, if this looks vaguely familiar, that's because it's meant to. It has its roots in the 60s, or was it the 50s? But the problem is that bringing elements of the design across to this new logo, the designers also imported a specific period feel. Not quite the values you want for a global corporation going into the 21st century.
Now, some would say that this criticism of the BBC's logo heritage is blasphemy, but I believe Martyn raises a really good point. The BBC blocks are iconic, there's no getting around that, so much so that even today in the 2020s, they're still utilised in some way. But ever since the early 60s, when the block concept with slanted letters first came about, that is very much what stuck for several decades to follow. Whilst this identified the BBC brand in a clear and simple manner, this design does have a sort of retro feel to it. That early 60s typeface and look, even though revised for the 80s and 90s, still in some respects feels like a product of its time.
The logo didn't work tactically either, alongside other BBC services and products.
The problem here is that you can never get the brand names to look comfortable alongside the diagonal logo. See what I mean?
Finally, the logo didn't work financially.
It's a 4-colour letterhead at its cheapest, but you also have 7-colour and even 10-colour letterheads, and that costs.
Yes, people, as anyone who has ever operated a colour printer regularly knows, more colours equals more money spent. and as Martyn says, when it comes to logos, it can be a doozy to the old wallet.
Before redesigning the BBC corporate logo, certain criteria had to be established. Technically, it would have to work in all media, from television, laptops and websites to a range of printing processes. Strategically, it needed to avoid being identified with any particular era. Tactically, it would need to work with all the BBC output areas, accommodating new ones, be simple to manage, and sit alongside all the different brand personalities. Financially, it would have to be less expensive to produce. Finally, there was an aesthetic consideration. The actual standard of design would have to be at a world-class level.
This is a tall order and a half. You've got to redesign one of the most recognisable British brands the world over and keep all of this in mind? It's a miracle they managed to come through with anything. But now we move on to the typeface, and a choice that in retrospect would have some controversial connotations.
With all this criteria in mind, we were in the market for a typeface. We settled on Gill Sans, not surprisingly designed by a man called Eric Gill. He was a master type designer who was most famous around about the 1930s. He was also a wonderful sculptor, and rather appropriately, you can find his sculptures around Broadcasting House. Eric Gill also represents that high standard of craftsmanship for which Britain and the BBC are renowned throughout the world.
So, Eric Gill. As described, he was indeed a master type designer as well as a renowned sculptor. However, he is also, a nonce. When his diaries were published in 1989, long after his death, it was revealed that he engaged in acts he definitely shouldn't have done with his adolescent daughters, at least one of his sisters, and even a dog. So, yeah, this is pretty disgusting stuff, and quite rightly, calls were rampant in getting his sculpture works removed, and for companies to abandon use of his typefaces. Surprisingly, it seemed by the mid-90s that this initial uproar was all but forgotten or just put aside, as Gill's typefaces were still very much in use, and indeed was going to become the main typeface of the BBC. I am surprised that by 1996, you have an informational film which is heralding the work of Eric Gill, without even a passing mention to what by then was pretty horrific public knowledge of the man's deeds behind closed doors. In 2022, one of the sculptures Gill designed for Broadcasting House was vandalised, and as of 2024, the sculptures remain by the building. It has been speculated, though, that the BBC's rebranding in 2021, away from the Gill Sans typeface to the custom BBC Wreath one, was partly to disassociate themselves from Gill and his works. But going back to 1996, rightly or wrongly, Gill Sans was indeed chosen as the new main typeface for the BBC, which would result in a logo I'm sure we're all too familiar with.
The main reason was far more practical. The BBC needed a typeface that was robust and elegant. Gill fits the bill to a T, you might say.
As a result, what was recommended was a very simple but highly significant change from this to this.
By doing this, we solve all the technical problems in one hit. No fine lines, no disappearing counters. And as you can see, we've kept the boxes and straightened them up. If we'd used a completely different shape to contain the letters, the result would have looked more like the Banstead Borough Council or the Big Biro Company. It would have lost its BBC-ness.
He's absolutely right, because by God, could you imagine if they went with any of these other shapes? Hideous.
The team realised that neither the aesthetic nor the technical arguments on their own would be reason enough to justify a project as big as a wholesale change in corporate identity.
However, the most compelling argument for changing the logo is this. What we do about this is dependent on the jobs it has to do. It has a corporate job, a nation's job, a region's job. It needs to work with the directorates. It has a commercial job. Then come the brands, TV brands, radio brands, and local radio brands. Now, even if you forget the aesthetics for a minute, this system delivers two benefits. One, it all looks like it comes from the same organisation. And two, you can add any name you like to it after the BBC logo.
The BBC certainly had and still does have a lot of brands, but you can see the argument that Martyn is making, and the uniformity of these examples that are shown here is undoubtedly quite nice.
What it doesn't deliver is personality. So for the brands, we need to inject personality another way. When you look at consumer brands, this is precisely how they approach the problem.
Levi's is a highly successful and visible consumer brand, which has a series of brand values which it wants to communicate to its target markets. The Levi's logo itself does not communicate all these values. That task is left to the marketing.
Like Levi's, we didn't try to put all the personality into the logo, but recognised that each BBC brand would have a property of its own to do that job. In the case of BBC Two, what the audience enjoys are the antics of the Twos, not the logo design. The Twos are famous, they communicate emotionally, and it's through them that people decide what they feel about the channel. So we'll keep Twos and simply add the BBC Two logo.
Isn't that the best summary of the 90s Twos you ever did here? Keeping them around to see out the decade was a brilliant move by LAMBIE-NAIRN and the BBC. If anything, I'd argue their presence helps ease the transition for audiences, especially since the flagship channel, BBC One, would be receiving a whole new ident set entirely in the form of the balloons.
The other new channels can develop their own properties as required, without destroying the consistency of the corporate identity.
The new brand identity also works for all the other on-screen elements, including the dog, the digital on-screen graphic in the top left-hand corner of the screen. Program menus, and uses the same type for all channels, centered to accommodate widescreen.
All this means two things. Firstly, it means a proportion of all BBC television channels in the future have been designed right now. The use of the logo and the typeface have already been determined. All that needs to be devised is the channel property. The effect of this will be that the channel identities will be considerably cheaper to produce. And the second benefit is that the BBC will have a way of doing television channels. The channel's typography consistent, but all the channel's personalities different.
This idea worked out brilliantly going into the 2000s. With the launch of new channels like BBC Three and BBC Four, Martyn is right that their typefaces, menu layouts, etc. were already set in stone, thus making it cheaper to create the channel brand and put more focus into the personality of it. And it doesn't come across any clearer than with the little slugs that helped launch BBC Three. What a treat they were.
3 is a magic number. Yes, it is.
This principle applies to all areas of the BBC, whether TV or radio. The new system also translates into print as a much simpler corporate styling, which delivers an enormous cost saving to the corporation. It also works on books and magazines, on websites and multimedia. In short, on anything that may be part of the BBC, both now and in the future.
This short informational film is truly a gem from the 1990s. Like I said before, the chance to get an insight into Martyn LAMBIE-NAIRN's creative process, it's like Christmas to those of us who take an interest in televisual design. It's also fascinating to see the challenges the BBC faced back in the mid-90s, the challenges of managing tons upon tons of logos whilst trying to keep the strength of the core BBC brand alive and well. The simple redesign, the straightening of the boxes, the removal of lines and counters, created a logo that would become instantly recognisable, memorable, and identifiable for the BBC for the next quarter of a century. Its roots may be controversial, as discussed, but when looked at purely and simply as a bit of televisual branding, it hit the jackpot. It worked on everything, it was cheap to produce, allowed new channels and offshoots to develop their own personality, while still feeling like a firm part of the BBC brand. It may not look like much, but the BBC's look, introduced in 1997, is still seen today by millions, myself included, as the defining look of the corporation. Martyn LAMBIE-NAIRN would continue his design work for decades to come, his stature only growing higher amongst his peers, and indeed the communities that were interested in televisual design, idents in particular. Sadly, Martyn would pass away on Christmas Day of 2020, at the age of 75. Tributes came in thick and fast, with some channels bringing out their old LAMBIE-NAIRN designed idents to pay their respects. For me, I owe a lot to Martyn. Without him and his team's influential work, I probably wouldn't have started up the ident review. I mark this video as a tribute to him, the great work he and his team achieved over many decades, and acknowledging just how much the design aspect of television changed for the better under their creative guidance. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Bruce Danton, Derek Chambers, Shaun Knock, Daud Khan, Liam De-Maine, Trev Hughes, Ajmac 200017, Deck, Evan Hart 41, Jen, Traffy, Tim Ripley, Mr. Eurovision 1986, Ted Elliott, Marnanel Thurman, John Wakefield, Kieran Bolton, 40-something Manchild, Jerry Ralph, and John McLeod, our AMTV staff members.